Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the official welcome and the official greeting. Our guests have arrived. They have had a tour of Durban. They have now experienced traffic jams. Some people say that when you live in Durban, you don't know about traffic jams like Joburg. And yes, Mike, we have extra 2 cars in Durban compared to Joburg. So yes, we do have those things. But nevertheless, a warm welcome to our presenters for today, Mike Schussler and Guy Lundy. I'm not going to go through their introduction and the CVs. I think you've already read them. You're already familiar and aware with their expertise. They're well-quoted personalities. They're well-known personalities across the business spectrum in South Africa. So I'm not going to go through all of these introductions. I think with that short intro, and Mike has just completed his coffee, I'd like to call upon him to undertake his presentation. Mike?
We were quite on time leaving our hotel, but, you know, the driver felt we should go to another venue. Rather than stick it out with you guys. I think it's something that's happened to the accounting profession. Everybody's trying to avoid you now. But don't worry, the Economist welcomes you. Been there for a longer time, and I think the lawyers too. And I understand with Tim Noakes' little thing now being low-carb diets and high-fat diets and everything being run a trial in America for 2 years now, and yesterday the results were published. And it turns out it helps people with type 1 diabetes, and so his little thing is working. I think the doctors and the dietitians will be joining us soon. So I think the way that they're going to define the professions one of these days is people who should actually be, given other degrees, such as degrees in lying or whatever. Now, when I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to start with the world economy. It's a very interesting arena that we're in, and it's really picked up a bit of steam in more cases than we really think about. And then I'm going to do sort of the accounting version of the economy, because I think you'll understand that and appreciate that a lot more than when I'm just talking inflation and growth and so on, and you'll see when we get there. I'm going to still do 1 or 2 slides quickly about the budget and ask ourselves a question, and then I'm going to give you a few pointers on some of the indicators. The first thing I'd like to do is just say, if you look at some of the selected big economies in the world, it's really a case of the emerging markets economies, the big ones running this world at the moment. It's an amazing feat. India and China are running ahead. The one quarter you'll find China's outperforming India. The next quarter you'll find India's outperforming China. But on a year-ago basis, you can see right now, I think it's India that's ahead. And they're doing quite well. Yes, they're growing fast. Per capita, they're not going to grow as fast as China, because China's not a democracy, and in a democracy, you cannot institute a one-child policy. So you cannot limit your population growth. But it's really an amazing story, if you wish, about the East Asian and South Asian economies, and also part of the non-oil part, if you wish, of the Near East and Northern Africa growing tremendously at the moment. It's really a story. I mean, I don't think we've had this in the world. And if you look at poverty, for example, as a very positive indicator, less than 13% of the world's population in 2015 is the latest data we have, are living less than $1.90 a day in purchase power parity terms. And, that's down from about 40% in 1980. That's a huge reduction. And although the people have only reduced in poverty by about 400 million, the fact is the population of the world has grown to 7.5 billion from about 5 billion in 1980. So you can see that impact has been very, very big, if you wish. And it's a really good story. But we don't get that headline. I mean, somebody said there should be a headline every day in the newspapers that says There's another 234,000 people that have left poverty behind yesterday. Just yesterday. But of course, that doesn't sell because it'd be the same headline, you know, the comma points might change or whatever. But here's a site in your mind that you can write down. It's called humanprogress.org. It's run by fellow economists from around the world, and they put out some really interesting stats. You know, if you want to compare our crime rate of 34 people being murdered out of every 100, you'll find that that was the rate in Europe in 1300. So they've got some very big stats there going back a while, and it puts things into context, how far we've come very often. The developed world, it's right now, I think Germany's in a sweet spot. We expected Europe to grow much quicker with the oil price declining from where it was. Now that the oil price is going up, maybe they'll come back a bit. And that's been good for them. The laggard here is the UK and Japan, for me, out of the developed countries. But we must remember Japan is not growing its population at the moment. So, you know, their per capita growth isn't too bad. But ultimately, the aging societies are starting to have an impact on their growth. Particularly Japan and Italy, I think, are the two best examples of that. UK is not doing well because of the Brexit thing. I think a lot of people just don't want to invest there right now, especially the banks. One forgets that the city of London, the square mile of London, is you know, the second most important financial center in the world. And those guys don't want to be cut off from Europe because that makes them the second most important financial sector in the world. Yeah, Russia and Brazil. Brazil's coming back up, but like us, they're commodity producers, so they were hit very hard. I mean, if you think we have political problems, Brazil's locking up its third president now. They've had the biggest decline in 103 years in the economy. They're coming out of it now, a lot stronger, and I'm glad for them. Russia is a bit of a cowboy country, if you wish. You can see here the two big blocks, developed blocks. It was really on the up until the beginning of this year. The business sentiment was really in record territory for the last 10 years or so. It's turned a little bit negative, or slightly, it's not negative, slower, but it's still in very much strong positive territory. And that says to me that the world economy is likely to continue growing, because when you've got these two other big blocks, along with India and China, growing, it's going to be a growth environment. And by all accounts, if I look at the last 2 years, or last year and this year so far, the growth forecasts from the IMF, now also about South Africa, and the World Bank, and the OECD about the world, has just been lifted up. And this is after 7 or 8 years of it always being, you know, very optimistic and then coming down. Now we've got pretty optimistic growth, and some people are even talking of the world growth going close to 4% this year. So it's a very positive environment. Yes, there are risks. We've just seen Mr. Trump institute sanctions on Iran, which is lifting the oil price. I just checked right now before I started. Oil price is up about 2.5%. That's always a brake on world growth, and it's not good for our inflation. It also is going to put a bit of a brake on the rand. The rand is also down because portfolio flows flow back into the United States in those sort of circumstances. So we have a bit of a, I wouldn't say a madman. I don't think but we have, I don't know what people do. Around the world, we seem to elect politicians that are a little bit off the beaten track, put it mildly. But Mr. Trump is a danger, because he wants to institute all these tariffs. It hasn't happened yet on the steel side. He said he's going to do it, but it hasn't gone through Congress, and against China, and China's retaliated. Now, if we go back, that is a big risk. We've seen that happen in the 1920s. We've seen when the world doesn't trade with each other anymore, that it will slow the world's growth, and it will impact everybody. And this is what we exactly don't want and don't need. So maybe that's why, you know, the business leaders of Europe, the whole of the EU and here and the America, are a little bit less optimistic, but they still seem to be optimistic. You can just see here, this is really a story of the emerging markets really raggeting the growth up. 60% of the world economy is now made up of the emerging markets. The China, India, Vietnam, Ethiopia, and Africa is doing absolutely wonderful. They have their own problems maybe, but in East Africa, and you can look at Latin America, you can look at Eastern Europe, all those places are doing quite well. And it's an amazing time period to be alive, really it is. South Africa is a bit of a laggard, and we'll get there just now. The commodity cycle in rand terms has just not gone anywhere. Coal and gold is holding up. Coal has done well. Iron ore's a bit hit at the moment. Platinum is a complete mess for us at this moment in time. With the diesel, it's not even our fault. The diesel scandals that Volkswagen organized very well for themselves has really put the diesel cars out of the mainstream, if you wish. And that's where most of the platinum is used in manufacturing. So that is hurting us a bit. I think that's the area in South Africa that's going to drag us down, other than stuff, is the mining sector this year, specifically the platinum. The emerging market currencies, you can see, they made up for part of that fall in the commodity prices that we've had. And yes, Argentina's done specifically badly, but they've come from a place where their currency was pegged to the dollar, and they tried to keep it up, and it just burst on them. And their politics were a mess. So when you free it up, it does that. They're rearranging their stuff. But the rest, most of these countries that have had big falls are all commodity producers. Go and have a look. It's South Africa, it's the Brazils, it's the Indonesias, and the like. Chile is also there. You could say Turkey isn't, but Turkey is very well linked to the oil markets there. Russia is a commodity producer, Mexico, Indonesia. India isn't. But you can see the big losers are the commodity losers in that sense. So when the rand falls, we tend to get a higher inflation rate. When it strengthens, we get a lower inflation rate. It's just one of those things that really has an impact on all of us. And at the moment, I wouldn't think we have a big inflation problem unless the rand goes past 13 Rand 50 to the dollar, I would think, overall. And I think we needed a bit of a weaker rand because, quite frankly, the platinum producers, the gold producers, and so on, and we forget those guys, the mining industry as such, buys 200, and I think in 2005 it was 240 billion of products from the rest of the South African economy, which is about 5% of our GDP, and they buy another 200 billion, or just a little less, of services from the rest of the economy, like security services and land surveyors and the like, and transport and the like. So I don't think inflation is going to be a problem, but I do think that we've probably seen the last of our interest rate declines. Might get one more. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about South African business. When I talk about South African business here, I mean your clients and you guys. I'm not talking about the banks. This is the non-financial, non-agricultural, corporate, and enterprise sector, if you wish. And this data all comes from Stats SA. And I call it the vanity, the sanity, and reality indexes. And I think it's important to note that these are very, very important things that we need to look at. Now, vanity is what it says. It's my ego. So I've got my own firm, and I like going to girls and say, I make 5 million Rand a year. Trying to impress them. But that's not the reality, is it? Because you guys know there's costs. So a business is not just its turnover. It's its costs, it's its returns and everything. But the first thing that you do need is that ego or that vanity. All right, you need that turnover first before you can step up to the plate. Okay? So there's growth here. It's above inflation. So that's a positive. I don't think we should undermine that. But here's our problem area. when I look at the assets that the South African private sector has employed here, those assets are not producing returns than the money you can get in the bank. So when people say business has a lot of money in the bank, one of the reasons is, as a shareholder of a business, I would get a bit angry if you say, you know, I'm going to give you a return of 6%, but I can get a return of 7% in the bank. So here I'm looking at a bit more longer term, and I'm saying, these are the assets I've employed, this is what's happening, and ultimately, I would like this to be delivering me much more than the money in the bank. Because it's a risky thing. Businesses don't survive, and quite sure all of you have seen businesses close down. So ultimately, this is the thing. I want a return, and I want a return above probably the risk-free rate, which is the government rate, which is even higher than this. But that's the one thing. And then you can see the impact of that when the money market rate is higher than the return that businesses get, businesses don't invest. It's a logical explanation. It really is that. And that's what I call the sanity. When you sit down and think, and you say, this is what I want. I want a return. Because anybody, I always do this because I'm looking for a friend who believes that business should not be in business for profit. Please put up your hands. I'm in desperate need of a friend. You see, so if you look at this, you guys know this as well as I do. You cannot sell SAA because their returns are negative. They own more than they're worth. So they're an 18 billion rand. So you cannot even give it away because you're giving somebody an 18 billion rand loss. Am I right? So you're actually going to have to pay someone to take SAA. You're going to have to say to them, think about it. You're going to have to do that. And that's the problem. So there's another thing that we need to look at in South Africa, and that's what I think you accountants are very good at. And that's the reality. The reality is, why are these businesses not closing? Why are they operating day to day? Well, the reality is very simply your turnover minus your expenses, but it leaves out depreciation and buying and selling of assets. Because you don't need to buy and sell those assets, and depreciation, everybody knows, you can depreciate a truck over 5 years or 7 years. You know, it can be stretched a bit. And here, the reality, after inflation, is still pretty positive. There's a turnover is 3% higher than inflation after you've taken away the expenses, if you wish. So that's not bad. For South Africa, I think that's okay. And the other thing we must remember is most of the businesses have they're still paying the managers. They're still paying the owner a little bit of a salary. So he's not only looking at that, he's looking at his job, he's looking at his friends around him, or the staff that he cares for, and the like. He's not going to close down because he's not making the returns. So this is the day-to-day reality. He might not invest more, but he's going to carry on. Am I right? So that's, for South Africa, that's good. So if I sum it up, and I'll get to some other indicators I've been working on, son. But if I put it in a barometer sort of way, in a dashboard, I think some people call it, I would say the vanity is pretty much okay-ish. It's not brilliant, but it's definitely, it's the sanity that is the real negative one, and the reality is really positive. So if I combine, we're pretty much in the middle. And I combine it on a third. It's not, you know, a very sophisticated economy type of model. But this is just to show you, give you a one sort of picture of how the businesses are doing on the ground. Not the state-owned enterprises, not the banks. Well, the state-owned enterprises are in this, in a way, the business parts of it. And that just gives you an idea. It won't have PRASA, for example, which is an agency of government, and it won't have SANRAL. They'll have Eskom and SAA in it. The other thing is, comes from the BER, is that business confidence, we've had a very big change in politics. It's gone up, but it's still not positive. Yes, the consumer confidence is at an all-time high, but I'm talking to a business audience. Your clients don't quite bite that 100% yet. They want to see the action on the ground. And that's the message we're getting from surveys, and that's the message we're getting from other factors in the economy, because I think people want to see the new president take over, and they want to see some positive steps being done. Be that for some people that corrupt get locked away and put into prison, or be it for other people that we see new road build or we get the stuff fixed. So we have certain things that are definitely happening. Pravin Gordhan is certainly making positive strides towards changing the boards of the state-owned enterprises in a major way. And the political strides that have been made, maybe we're not going to have the premier of the Northwest anymore, and that might strengthen Cyril Ramaphosa's hand, and then he can do more. But the business community is saying, right, we're going to give you a chance, but we want to see action on the ground. That, I think, is the reality of what all these surveys are saying. And this is just a summary of it. And you can see if that business confidence isn't there either, then our fixed investment, particularly the private part, is not going to go up. So it's going to be a while yet before the construction companies, for example, are going to be in the A-OK place where so on. The other thing that's happened, and this is just the Zuma years, if you wish, or the last part of the Zuma years, is if we look at fixed direct investment, foreign direct investment, I'm not talking portfolio flows that go in and out of the stock exchange or the bond market. I'm talking about people putting money down. So when they take more than 10% of a company, it becomes foreign fixed direct investment when they buy, say, ABSA, but by one player, not 10 different asset managers. It depends who it is. So when Barclays bought ABSA, that was a positive here. Now that Barclays is selling and so on, and I'm not quite sure how the Steinhoff thing works out, because Steinhoff is now an international company, but it'll be selling part of a South African company called Star, more or less. But this just puts it into perspective. And if you go to the JSE today, the JSE, 70% of the turnover of the JSE is from outside our borders. In fact, it's outside the RAND borders. So it's outside of Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland, South Africa. So that's quite a shock, because an emerging market should be growing faster, should be able to attract money, because the developed countries cannot grow quite as quickly, do not normally have the profit margins because there's a lot more competition. So they want the emerging markets to have this, and that's what we haven't got. And to go down to 30%, I wrote an article recently pointing out that the change in today's money is roughly about 2.7 trillion rand. And if you look at it where the other emerging markets are, other than us and Malaysia, but if you look at India, China, all the big ones, the top 20 or so, it's about 35%, 30 to 35% of their GDP in most cases. If we were there, it would be over 3 trillion rand, and therefore 3 trillion jobs, if each job cost $1 million. And to give you an idea, this new thing in PE where they're putting a chemical factory together, and that's a high investment type thing for chronic meds. Can't remember, that's it. That's 500 jobs. That's 2 million a job. But then you get in agriculture, you get jobs a lot cheaper. And if you take a truck might cost you 2 million, but it normally means that there's 2 truck drivers, and there's normally somebody working as a mechanic, or at least partly. So you get a bit more than a son. So those are the sort of things that you can think of yourself. So if I tell you, in scaring away the South African guys, with other words, what I've done here is I've taken the amount of money foreigners have put in here, and the amount of money South Africans have taken away, and so on. That's the net effect. Scary. So this political transformation has to be successful. If we want to bring down the unemployment rate, because the World Bank says for each 1% we bring down the unemployment rate, the Gini coefficient will come down with 1.2 points. So if you normalize unemployment in South Africa, we'll have a Gini coefficient roughly in the 40s, which would be very much on the lower end of emerging markets. What we need for that is we need the employers. And here is something that we don't always think of, but this is the amount of employers we have in South Africa per adult. And that's around 46 now. So we have just 2% of our adult population, just over that, are employers. So that's another thing. If we have scarcity somewhere, it's on the employer side. And that's something we should look after. Because it doesn't help you'll be a dumb politician to not recognize this. Because if you say to people, well, I hate the employers, and we'll get you more money, and we'll do all this, and the employers turn around and say, wait a minute, I'm leaving. Far fewer employers leave to make this a very, very bad situation. So you should look around and say, wait, I want to be in partnership with the employer. Am I right? And I want to be, no, I'm right, that's the right attitude. That's what we want. And that's what people are hoping for. I think it's more likely to happen now under the new government, and I think in future, because I think we're starting to learn our thing. I hope we've learned a few lessons here. And I know because some guys in government are also looking at this all of a sudden and saying, wait, we need these. And what we also need, which we keep forgetting ourselves, if we're a bit more in the formal sector, we keep forgetting about the self-employed. But only about 4% of South Africans are self-employed. The country, it's not, they don't do all countries, but it's a global entrepreneurship monitor, looks at countries, and the highest that they've got is 28% of Ugandans are self-employed. In East Asia, in East Africa, it's very much a case of between 12 and 20% of people being self-employed. This is our employer's school. Whether it's a nursery school or a primary school, I'm not always sure, but I think it goes through stages. And if you can get this going, and you can tell people, and we spoke about it just in the thing, we've got to set our minds different. And our minds have got to be really, we've got to work for ourselves. Our minds have got to be, and I think the accounting profession has a role to play. Because a lot of these small guys have no idea about what they should be doing or how their book should look, because they're skimping to get by. But I think the accountants, sometimes when you take a small guy like me and you take our hand and say, this is how it works, because even economists don't understand all these things. And this is the thing that you should be doing and looking at. These are the indicators that will drive you to success. And I think those are the sort of things. You cannot help the guy be an entrepreneur, but you can help some of the technical aspects as they go forward. And I think that's an important fact. I think the other thing is we keep forgetting is that the consumer in South Africa is a lot richer. I don't know, I'm going to skip the following slides a bit quick, but not just in interest, but if we look even before the intervention of the national minimum wage, you can see our sectoral minimum wages aren't that low in many cases, and these are the ones that are legally enforceable. So you can see, and just to put it into context, a doctor in Cuba earns about $20. This is 2014 or something money. That's less than a domestic worker in South Africa. So we know what works worldwide. We know that these are the things that we want to concentrate on. We also know that we've got household debt, but that's the other thing. I think that's made out to be much worse than it is. I'm not saying it's 100% in line or it's low or anything like that, but if you look here, Greece and Portugal, for example, the people are as rich as we are, and they've got a large amount of debt. Whereas, yes, Germany is a lot richer, and they have a little bit more debt, but in terms of rich people can always afford more debt. But we're certainly not out of line. And On top of that, our consumers, despite retail sales being up recently, have been paying down their debt burden quite substantially. We're now at just under 72, so we've brought it down with more than 16% as a part of our salary. So our debt problems, I wouldn't say it's going away, but is overstated. And guess who keeps on telling you about this? Is the debt counselors. Because they're not getting bloody clients. So they have to tell people how bad it is. And in the hope that their name sticks in consumers' minds. We've got a lot of assets. We have the 5th largest pension fund assets to GDP in the world. We have the 8th largest, in dollar terms, pension fund assets in dollar terms in the world. There's 16.5 million accounts there, of which I think it's about 12 million people. That's a huge amount. It's very, very spread amongst formal workers, not amongst the unemployed. There is obviously some people who've lost their jobs who can't get their old pensions at this moment in time. I don't know if you know this. Our home ownership as a percentage of households is in the top 40 of the world as well. We have a huge amount of assets. We don't always talk about it, we don't always think about it, and everybody claims to be poor. But this is another thing that we can add to the confidence measures in South Africa and make people think and realize. You just fly over Inanda Dam when you come into Durban with your plane, and you look out the window and you see how much there is. You go to Bushbuck Ridge, you go to Tuyando, and you see huge houses. So sometimes the policy that we should have is maybe, how do we get the jobs into those areas, not just allow the people to come here and stay in shacks and feel poor. We've got to look at that whole picture maybe in the future when we go there. This is the growth forecast from the Reserve Bank, and you can see it's been lifted from what it was before. The IMF has increased our growth. The private sector is increasing its growth forecast. So this year looks already a lot better, just on the back of that higher business confidence and the higher consumer confidence. Next year, the Reserve Bank sees a bit of a pullback. Most of the private sector guys see it going a bit stronger. But nonetheless, I think at this moment in time, we've just got to say we're not quite out of the doldrums, because that black line is where our population growth is. It's about 1.7% again. It went down to around 1% because of the HIV and AIDS scenario now that we're taking care of people there. But the point is, this needs to be about double. It's looking better. It's certainly, I think, just the political change. Because there's not been many rule changes. Yes, we've had the land story, and that makes people worried. It's no doubt that that's a problem. But if you just look at what the positiveness has done of a leadership change so far, it has helped. And it's helped more than I thought it would. But we need more. And this is the thing. If you're growing at 1.7% of your population, you want people to get richer, you want to grow, say, double your population growth. Just as a sort of rule in my terms, and then you start bringing down unemployment. So we need to grow at 3.4%, roughly speaking. And if we really want to do it in a period of, say, 20 or 30 years, we probably have to grow 3 or 4 times that. So we have to then start saying to ourselves, wait, we have to grow past 5% or maybe even close to 7%. So that should be the focus. How do we grow South Africa quicker and quicker and quicker? There's certain things we can do. We can change the visa regulations for tourists to come into the country. Just take them away. If you've got a passport, you can come. You can put the whole of SACU into one application. People could go to Swaziland or Namibia or Botswana, and they're on an internal flight. Make it easy. And a place like Durban will feel the impact of that positively. So will many other areas. That's just, and it's not going to cost us money. Already, our new finance minister, Minister Nene, I had a talk to him when I was down in Cape Town for the Raging Bull, where I said, we need to transfer the houses that people have, the RDP houses, the traditional area houses and so on, into people's names. There's 3 million they've just recently said, Treasury's looking and they're starting to implement 817,000 houses that are going to be transferred, RDP houses from government and old municipal houses from government to individual families. And then they want to look at going further. But those are the ones I think they've got the easy records of, because unfortunately our record keeping isn't always brilliant. But that will make a difference, because today an RDP, you can go to Gumtree. An RDP house without title deeds changes for 250,000 rand. With title deeds, it'll be more. It'll give people something to go to the bank with and get a loan, and it's going to make their loan cheaper. It gives people pride. It does a lot of other things. So there are things that we can do, and that's just an admin cost. Just very quickly, and my friend from Grant Thornton knows this very well, because I did it, but this is a long-term thing. We already have very high tax rates in South Africa. These are the highest tax countries as a percentage, the tax burden of GDP. And you can see Lesotho is up there, but they get more than half of that money from us. Namibia and Swaziland. And then we're in number 7. I left out oil producers and very small countries. Countries with less than 1 million, and oil producers, because oil producers are all over the place. They'll give you the wrong thing. For example, if the state company is an oil company in Saudi Arabia, you have very low taxes. If it isn't, then you have very high taxes. And that puts it into perspective. And you can see here, our tax burden is higher than Sweden. Do you know that? So that's the other thing. That reduces that return on assets. That reduces that profit. Because if you look here, the company tax rates, we've got the 5th highest tax burden in the world. It's not just about the rate, but it's about what you can write off. You accountants know that, don't you? And where that rate kicks in. In America, you're a small company if you've got a 20 million turnover or 25 million, I can't remember which. Turn that into rands and come to South Africa and say, I've got a 300, let's make it 25, sorry, 300 million rand turnover company, I'm a small company, I should get a tax break, I should only be paying 19%. Excuse me? So when we try to attract a small company in America to open a branch here, or a medium-sized company, and they're thinking, well, while we're small, we'll pay less. It doesn't work like that. And then there's all sorts of things. So this is the fairest way to measure the tax burden, if you wish. And on the personal tax side, we're going up. We're in number 11 or number 12 now. And if you go here, even if you include the oil countries here, we are there. Oil countries don't have much in personal income tax, generally speaking. So if you look at this, this is high, and we're getting higher, because these numbers are from 2015, and our own Treasury says we'll go to over 10% of GDP. And that will take us past America, because America's just relaxed its top tax rate, and they've adjusted some other things. They're coming down from 39.5% to 37%. Germany's reducing its tax rates, and so on. So we need to understand that if we're paying this much in tax, we need to get something back for it. Here's the world average, and ours, and Europe, and you can see how we've grown as a percentage of GDP, and you can see we're out of sync. We're out of sync. We need to do something. We need to reduce taxes. That's the reality. If you want to get that growth, we're going to have to find a way to do things cheaper. Government says they're going to bring down spending. It's not true. As a percentage of the economy, they see spending at least flat, or if not slightly going up. You can see that there in this graph. And here's where we can save money. Put it to you that our government sector takes nearly half our money, our tax money, the salaries. If I add the agencies like PRASA and SANRAL and the universities, I get to 55 cents in every rand. That's a lot. That's the area we're going to have to save on. Not with the amount of people necessarily, but here, this is what we're going to have to do. And that's what the finance minister's trying to do, and say, look, if we grow 2% above inflation, I should only be giving you inflation increase, because I need to bring down that burden that you guys and your salaries are doing. That is going to be the critical fight that you need to watch this year, because this is the big negotiations going on, and they haven't settled yet. When I was here last, there was still time. They were supposed to have settled by the end of April. This is going to be interesting, because I think this is going to get hard. And the other thing is, we've got to look at bringing down our debt burden, because otherwise we will be downgraded. So if we lose the fight on the salaries of the civil servants, we will be downgraded, because we'll have to go. Here's just very simply put, we've brought poverty down. It's come up slightly again. I think we can change that if we can attract the investment, bring in the confidence that we've already got, all those sort of things. But here's my other thing. It's not just about poverty, it's about that inequality. And that poverty comes from the same factor, and that's that unemployment rate of 27%. And the World Bank, after I did this, released a report. And I know of another report that's coming, probably being released in the second half of this year. But yes, South Africa's got a huge inequality. But the inequality stems from our own stupidity, from the present stupidity, most of it. And it's not going back to apartheid. Yes, it has a role. Apartheid has a role to play, definitely. But the increase in this, and it should have decreased with all the taxation that we've done, all the sort of things. And as I said, the World Bank's report shows that because our unemployment has increased from 15% to 27% from 94 to now, is the main driver of the inequality and the poverty. If we were back down to 15%, our inequality would be still high, but it would be around about where a lot of other emerging markets are, be they Brazil or Vietnam or whatever the case may be. So if we bring it down further and we go into single figures, we'd be at the best end or the better end of emerging markets. So this is the fight that we've got to have, not the minimum wage. We've got to look at how we get people employed. And I know that many of the current ministers know this. It was emphasized by Dlamini Zuma. It was emphasized by Nene. It was emphasized by many others. So this is something that we've got to talk about. I'm going to finish. I'm just going to leave you with a thought or two. We will and we are growing better than we did in the last 3 or 4 years. It will be an easier year. The world economy is doing well, should do well till about next year, at least I think, or relatively well. It won't be a break on our economy. So we've got a bit of time to get a lot of things right now, and we've got to make use of that time period. Our inflation has really surprised on the downside, but unfortunately, because of the VAT increase, now the oil prices, the tax increases on fuel, the sugar taxes, all those sort of things, it's going to start coming up. And having been at the Reserve Bank meeting, I think the interest rates aren't going up now, but it looks like the last of the cuts are here. And if we get one more cut, it will be a 25 basis point cut, and then they're going to be on hold for about a year. Unless we obviously have a big oil price shock now with this Iran story and oil goes back over 100, that's a different story. But as things look now, it looks like interest rates are going to be around about where they are now for quite a while still, probably in the range of 2 or 3 years. So, and with the roundabout, I mean within 0.5% either way. I don't think it's going to change much. I think that's where we're looking at. And the Reserve Bank has established itself, I think, as a good implementer of monetary policy. So inflation is not going to be a problem, but interest rates are not going to decline much. They're not going to go up much, so we're going to live where we are. Our growth rate is looking decidedly better. I think the Reserve Bank is erring on cautious side for next year now. I think we're going to get closer to 2%, but it's not enough. We need to go that one step higher. And I think overall, there are going to be problem areas in the economy. as there is a drought in the Western Cape that we have no control over, or the platinum price that we don't have a control over, it means it's not exactly the right time to open a new mine in Rustenburg, okay? But what it does say to me is most of our cylinders are here, and most of our engine can work. We've got a little bit of time to fix it, change the oil, change the gears, get going, and implement the right sort of foreign policy, implement the right local policy. Look at the stuff from Home Affairs right through to AXA, right through to all the state-owned enterprises as we're seeing they're getting better boards and so on. It's not going to change overnight, but if we can do all those things and a little more, because there's a lot on our table, we can get South Africa back on track. I think we are in a better environment at least, and I'm feeling a lot more positive, but there's still an element of caution. I thank you. Are we taking questions afterwards?
Thanks a lot, Mike, for that insight. I think there has been a lot that has been shared with you, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions that you got running in your mind. If I can please ask you just to keep them until we complete the next presentation by Guy Lundy, who's a senior partner at Corn Ferry. He also has a master's in future studies at from Stellenbosch University. For those of you who didn't know, yes, there is such a degree as future studies, which Guy will talk a little bit more on in terms of his thoughts and ideas looking forward. So if you can join me in welcoming Guy Lundy to the stage.
Thanks. Great, well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I always enjoy coming to Durban, especially at this time of year when Joburg's weather is disastrously dry and freezing cold. So it's always very nice. I'll in fact be back here in a few weeks to do the half Ironman, which is also always good fun here in Durban. A very nice break to kind of get away from it all. So as you heard, I'm a futurist. I have a master's degree in future studies. And yes, that is a real degree. They give you a piece of paper and stuff. It says you've got a master's degree. And it's something that's quite interestingly South African, in that we have quite a number of futurists in South Africa. Obviously, the one that's probably most well known is Clem Santa, and has been doing the futurist gig for a very long time, that along with his giggle. And it's interesting because South Africans have generally tended to have this sort of combination of very short-term thinking and quite long-term thinking. Because of our fairly bizarre history that we have, it has been necessary for us to look beyond the immediate and what's happening around us. It's always very important for us to know what's going on around us today and probably tomorrow, but it also helps us in terms of maintaining hope and maintaining an eye on what we should be doing so that 20 years from now it looks different to today if we take a longer-term view as well. So that is one of the things that I do. The other thing that I do, if you look at my bio, and it's fairly confusing, so it probably helps if I explain it slightly, is that yes, I am a senior client partner at Corn Ferry, which is the world's biggest executive search firm. That is not why I'm here. Okay? I'm not here to recruit anybody. I play CEOs and that sort of thing, but that's not what I'm looking for today. So I'm going to be taking you through an idea of what I see as being South Africa and the world going into the longer term. So something beyond 2020, because we do tend to look at the sort of 1-2 year picture most of the time. But let's have a look at what goes beyond that. And if you sit here, for example, in Umhlanga, and we look back 30 years or 20 years, and you look at what was around this area back then, and you look at what it is today, you can see how if you had invested here 20 or 30 years ago, you could have benefited enormously. So it really does help to also take that longer-term view as well. So looking at what's happening in South Africa at the moment, this is the Mercantech CEO Confidence Index per quarter over the last few quarters. And it really ties in with what Mike's been saying, which is that confidence among CEOs. This is 1,000 CEOs in the South African economy of companies, big, small, and medium-sized, looking at how positive they are about where things are going at the moment. You can see that in the last quarter, we've had a significant increase in confidence. Now, that's a very good thing because it means that those people that have been sitting on their money and sitting on their hands, not making decisions around investing, will start to consider that stuff. But you can also see how susceptible we are to a very short-term change, changing our view. It does mean that there's a risk on the downside as well, and Mike and I were talking about this last night. Both of us probably feel that in the next quarter you're going to see something of a dip because the reality is going to set in. There's going to be the sense that Cyril Ramaphosa actually has a hell of a task on his hands, and he's got a longer-term process that he has to go through in order to get South Africa on the right track. And, you know, the last 9 years of Jacob Zuma, and of course we're in KZN, so we'll be quite lenient on Jacob Zuma, but the last 9 years have been troublesome. They've been difficult, and they've certainly introduced a culture and behaviors within their South African politics and economy that have not necessarily been positive, and that will take time to reverse. So getting overexcited in the short term is a risky thing to do. I think we need to temper it with a little bit of reality and not get too excited about things in the short term. But in South Africa, we've tended to do this for a very long period of time. Mike showed this same graph a little bit earlier. This is the business confidence index of the Bureau for Economic Research dating back to 1975. And anyone who saw me speak last year will see I showed the same thing. It's an absolute roller coaster. So we've had periods like 1976 where there were the riots that broke out in Soweto and then kind of led to a massive conflagration through the country, through to 1980 where the gold price went through the roof, and then 1984 with the Groot Crocodile and his famous Rubicon speech. And so South Africans tend to have these massive fluctuations in terms of the way that we feel about where things are going. You can see that in the last 10 years, since 2008, it's been a very mixed bag. People have been very uncertain about whether they should be positive or not. And every time it kind of tends over towards the positive, it's tended to get knocked back down by something again. That's obviously a factor of what's been going on globally. Since 2008, the world has been in a very difficult place economically. And of course, also the local political and economic situation over the years, which have been difficult. So what is interesting, though, is, again, if you look at the short term, you can see that recently we've had quite a significant increase in business confidence subsequent to December. So with December and the political change and now the moves that are being made in the right direction in terms of sorting out the institutions, the boards, changing people on those boards, etc., we're starting to see a rise in confidence. And let's hope that it pushes over to the positive and then stays there for at least a period of time so that we can start to consolidate some of the improvements. But what I try to encourage people to do is to really look at it in a much longer term sense. And when I say much longer, I'm talking really much longer. I'm talking sort of 70, 80 years worth of longer changes that are taking place. Because it's these changes that really drive the shorter term behavior that people don't even realize that they're experiencing at the time. So if you look at it in terms of industrial revolutions, there's a lot of talk at the moment about going into the fourth industrial revolution. And if you take it back to the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, etc., you can see that technological change has driven a significant amount of change in the way that people live. So back to the first industrial revolution, you can see the picture on the bottom left there. It's of children working in coal mines. Now, it's interesting for me because I've done a lot of family history research. When my mom died some years ago, I decided it was time for me to understand a little bit more about the family and the history and all that sort of thing. And so I went off to the UK and started digging in to see what my family had been. And of course, when we do this stuff, we always want to know that we're related to royals. I can assure you that I am not. And in fact, what was really interesting to see was that if you look at the censuses in the late 1700s, my family were weavers. And they had the cottage industry. The whole family were listed on the census as being weavers living in the same house. I've in fact even been to the house. It's really quite fascinating. The next census, one generation later, they were all coal miners, every last one of them. This was in Yorkshire. The next census, interestingly enough, my great-great-grandfather was the head of the Yorkshire Coal Miners' Union. So he was Cyril Ramaphosa of his day. That is beyond anything else to do with what I'm talking about here. But what you can see is that when these revolutions take place and these technologies get introduced, it changes the world in such massive ways that it impacts on the way that people live, going from being cottage industry weavers to working down the underground in the coal mines, and then moving into factories with the second industrial revolution, where it became really about factories and about much more automation and around people sitting in long banks and long rows doing the same repetitive task over and over again. The third revolution, which has taken place over the last 100 years, has really been around automation and taking it away from human hands. So with the auto industry, for example, which you guys know well in this area, it's no longer about people. People don't stick bolts and things onto cars anymore. It's about robots that are doing that particular task. We're in the process at the moment of going into this fourth revolution, this fourth industrial revolution, which is about data. It's about replacing of people's thought processes when it comes to repetitive tasks, that sort of thing. And it's about blending automation and intelligence. And that is in the process of creating massive change for the way in which we live today, and is going to continue to create change for the way in which we live tomorrow. So it's a change that's taking place, and this exactly the same discomfort that my ancestors felt when they went from their idyllic little house in Yorkshire underground into the coal mines is the same sort of discomfort that we're experiencing across the board in society today. What tends to happen with these things, though, is that you do get backlashes. And so what we've experienced here in South Africa and around the world over the last 10 years has been a social backlash against the change that is underway, without us really realizing that that's why we're behaving the way that we are. So the first thing is that you tend to get a backlash against the traditional establishment. We see this in politics. So the traditional political establishment is being replaced at the moment. And people that we have thought as being the people that should be our leaders are no longer our leaders. They're not the people that are leading us at the moment. And I'll talk a little bit about that in some more detail in a moment. There's also social unrest. There are things like in this country, the fees must fall movement. There's people standing up and saying, no more am I taking the kind of stuff that I've been willing to take over the last 20 years. So this Me Too movement that's coming out, for example, seems to have just popped up with overnight, where suddenly Harvey Weinstein and various people like that are suddenly they're being outed. So there's this social unrest, there's this backlash against what has been accepted and considered not acceptable behavior, but certainly nobody's done anything about it for a period of time, is now people are standing up and they're working against that. On a global scale, you've got a growth in independence movements. We've seen this with Brexit. We see it with Scotland wanting to break away from the UK, with the Basque countries now going back into wanting to break away from Spain like they did many years ago, and so on. And one of the ways in which we try and deal with this stuff psychologically is that we move into this space of wishful thinking. And that's where I have some superheroes down on the bottom right. So you see during this period of change and this period of discomfort, people look for a superhero. They want somebody to rescue us from the discomfort that we're all feeling. And so this growth in the superhero genre in movies, for example, is a direct result of the fact that people are they're wishing that Superman was able to reappear and save us all from the mess that we find ourselves in. So if you look back in history, you'll see that when the superhero genre was established, it was in the 1930s. So Superman first came out as a comic in 1938, and so he is now, whatever he is, 80 years old or something like that. But it's a clear indication that people are looking for a Superman to come and help them. And that plays itself out in things like politics, where you have the strongmen that appear in politics because people are looking for a Superman to solve the problems that they can't solve themselves. So one of the other interesting things that happens with this social backlash that I've been watching with real interest, because it just fascinates me, is this Flat Earth Society movement. I don't know if you've noticed the number of people that are out there on social media trying to convince the rest of the world that it is actually flat. So for 500 years, we've known without much of a shadow of a doubt that the world is a globe. And all of a sudden, you've got this growth of people who are convinced that the world is actually flat. And the idea that it's a globe is some sort of a conspiracy theory coming out of NASA. So, these are some of the memes that I found on the internet recently, where, NASA's budget is $19.3 billion, and what do we get for it? Fake pictures of the Earth, because it's not really a globe. Here's another one, and this is, in fact, I have a childhood friend who I'm connected with on Facebook, and so I get these memes through Facebook just about every day, this kind of thing, which is that the proof of the fact that the world is flat is that when you look at the horizon, it's flat. So never mind Copernicus and all of the rest of it, the Earth is flat. So that for me is a real fascinating indication of this backlash against what we've been brought up to believe. Okay? As idiotic as it may seem to think that the Earth is flat, and every pilot that has flown around the world will tell you that, the last time he checked, he didn't kind of go over the edge. He did come back to the beginning again. It doesn't seem to register with them. So, talking now about the political change and the impact of some of those changes. So, we've got a process at the moment where, and it's been going on for the last few years, where the old are on their way out. So, of course, we believed in Clinton and in Obama and all of those sorts of traditional leaders that have been seen as the leaders of the world. And, of course, that was the Obama and Clinton love story. We really, certainly us here sitting on the other side of the ocean, thought that it was likely to be Clinton, because no way can anyone be stupid enough to elect Trump. But of course, we all know what ended up happening. But the same thing's happening around the world. You've got people like Sarkozy in France, who is now being outed for his interestingly dodgy friendships with people like Gaddafi and various others. And so there's that backlash against what that traditional establishment is in France as well. Mike spoke about the Brazilian leaders, one after another, going into prison. This is Lula, who, of course, also had lots of dodgy friends. I'm not entirely sure why people are surprised to hear that. But it's the same thing. South Korea, President Park's also been sent off to prison for having dodgy friends and doing various interesting things with kickbacks. Mugabe, after some 30 worth years of activity, now on his way out. And then, of course, in our own country, our former president, Jacob Zuma, who I think most people thought was Teflon and really managed to keep himself outside of being ousted for a very long period of time. But that period is now over. And interestingly, we're starting to see the cleanup that's starting to come through as a result of that, which is exactly the same cleanup as is happening all over the world. So we are not isolated, we are not alone, we really are a part of the process that's happening around the world at the moment. So coming in with the new, we have two types of new leaders coming in. The first one being what I call the strong men, and that the first one is of course Putin, very well known, has been around for a long time, and is very definitely a strong man. You don't go against Putin and survive it particularly easily. Many of the oligarchs that have been taken out around the world will tell you that. People that are sitting in prison, you don't go against Putin. Putin is a very, very difficult character to try to beat. Erdogan in the bottom right-hand corner, Turkey, very much a strong man, has put 30,000, 40,000 people who oppose him into prison. They actually cleared the prisons in Turkey so that they could create space for the political prisoners about 2-3 years ago. Top right-hand corner, Rodrigo Duterte, who is the president of the Philippines, very much like Donald Trump, a businessman, an outspoken proponent of killing people who are involved in the drug trade, and has been credited with killing tens of thousands of people that are involved in the drug trade in the Philippines, and absolutely unapologetic about it. And then, of course, Donald Trump, who has just made the call recently, as of last night, in fact, that they're pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. So I wouldn't necessarily call Donald Trump a strongman in the same sense as I would the likes of Putin, but at the same time, it is worth noting that his behavior is certainly less democratic. It's much more hardline. So I'd probably put him in the same category as a hardliner rather than necessarily a strongman. And, you know, what is interesting is that these strongmen and these hardliners do tend to stick together. And so there's a lot of stuff coming through around what's happened with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and the very strange links between them. And it does happen. It does tend to happen. If you look at what happened in Europe in the 30s, those dictators that were characteristic of the time did work very closely together, the likes of Hitler and Stalin and various others at the time. There's another type of new leader that's coming in, and that's the leader that is bringing in new hope. And certainly I would hope that these are the leaders that are going to take us forward. I think the reality is that we're going to continue to have a divergent world where you've got these strong men and you've got these leaders of hope. But let's have a look at who some of them are. So Emmanuel Macron in France has come in. He's very much the young leader, very charismatic, pushing a new message of new hope within the world, and somebody that I think has the ability to take us into a new space and a new sort of empathetic international mindset. Also interesting and probably most well known for the fact that his wife is 20 years older than him. So a different way of being, a different way of living, different way of doing things. Justin Trudeau, the president of Canada, also a young leader, around 40 years old, very much a leader of hope and pushing a new message. And then on our own borders, we have João Lourenço, who's the new president of Angola, and interestingly pushing quite a hard line against José Eduardo dos Santos, who is probably one of the most corrupt leaders in history and is well known as being the richest man in Brazil. So Lourenço is really pushing the message that things are changing in Angola. Corruption is no longer acceptable. And Dos Santos' daughter, you may recently have seen, has been pushed off a number of the boards that she sits on and is currently being ousted from the very, very tight hold she has over the Angolan economy. She is the richest woman in Africa currently, but his message is that this is no longer acceptable. And then, of course, in our own country, Cyril Ramaphosa, whose whole message is about a new dawn and a South Africa with new hope. So these are the two types of leaders that are starting to emerge through this process, this maelstrom that we're going through at the moment. On a broader global scale, there's an interesting change that's also starting to take place. As much of the sort of chaos takes place in established economies, you generally tend to start to see new economies start to rise. So if you look back at the early 1900s, we saw the decline of Europe and particularly the United Kingdom, which was very much the leader of the 1800s, and you saw the United States start to increase. That went through to the Second World War, and after the Second World War, what the United States did was that they implemented the Marshall Plan. They poured money into Germany and Japan, which they had fundamentally destroyed through the Second World War, and that led to tremendous growth in America as well as in those countries as well. So Japan and Germany, which were utterly broken by 1945, were given the boost by the US economy to grow to what they are today. And that, of course, took the US economy and provided them with new markets and new ways of doing business. So everybody within that little circle rose. Exactly the same thing is starting to happen now with China. China have a policy which is called One Belt, One Road. And it's driven on the idea that they want to have the Silk Road, which has existed for thousands of years, be fundamentally rebuilt over land, taking product and services and everything else from China into Europe and right through to the UK. Interestingly, last year, the first train that ran from Beijing to London arrived in London. So non-stop, one train that took a railway line the whole way through from Beijing to London. And so that one road is very much a strategy of theirs. And then the One Belt, which is a maritime Silk Road, they call it. And that's looking at moving into other areas of Southeast Asia, into Africa, particularly using Mombasa and Nairobi as their gateway into Africa, and through the Middle East, the Suez Canal, etc., into Greece and into Italy, into Europe from there. So it's a $1 trillion infrastructure investment plan that they have, and it's very much along the same lines as what the Marshall Plan was. Pour money into these economies that have possibility and growth opportunity, and be a part of providing them with what they need to grow, so that they grow and China grows. So it's a very interesting mirror of what happened 50, 60 years ago, but in a different part of the globe. So from a South African perspective, let's look at how we can be a part of this One Belt, One Road policy and benefit from that infrastructure investment that's taking place around the world. Of course, in order to benefit from that, South Africa's got to be in a position. So exactly as Mike was talking about, if we want foreign direct investment in South Africa, we have to be in a strong position to attract it. There are a couple of things that I think characterize South Africa in 2018, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. The first one is that we do have corruption that has become quite endemic over the last 10 years and possibly longer. And I think that it's something that has to be rooted out if we're going to attract the kind of investment that we need to have in this country. So corruption is something that Cyril Ramaphosa is, I believe, starting to try to deal with. And with ousting the Premier of the Northwest, I think that's a step in that direction. It's a signal to those that have been kind of with their hands in the cookie jar that this is no longer the way that we do things around here. So a step, I think, in the right direction. There's obviously political change underway. We're seeing what some would describe as a purge, but there's political change that's taking place across the country in South Africa at the moment. I think in the short term, be ready. 2019 is an election year, and election years in South Africa are always messy. So we can see what's happening in the DA, we can see what's happening in the ANC. Politics is going to be a tough space for a while to come. Ratings downgrades are certainly on hold at the moment. I think we can expect that if we were to experience another ratings downgrade, it would certainly be a surprise right now. So that's, sorry, I'm moving one ahead. But we have low growth at the moment, but it is starting to move as Mike was talking about. I talked about the ratings downgrades at the moment being on hold. And there's work going on to rebuild the institutions, to rebuild the state-owned companies, get them to a position where we can actually rely on them again, and also bring people into things like the State Security Agency. We've seen the change that's taken place there, really attempt to try to rebuild those institutions and get them going in the right direction. And I think that one of the things that we've got to take into account as South Africa that puts us in quite a strong position is that we do have a legacy of good infrastructure. We have built good roads, we've got good rail in place, we've got good airports, good ports, we've got a whole range of things like electricity infrastructure, etc., that are in place that don't have to be built from scratch. So as things start to pick up, we can get that momentum going much more quickly than countries that just don't have that infrastructure. So that's kind of a little bit about South Africa. I want to go briefly into a longer-term look at some of the effects that it's going to have on us. These changes that are taking place in the world are going to have on us as people. And I want to really look at how we're going to live going into the future. Some of the things that we're going to experience around the way in which we live. This is a picture of Tokyo. And it's interesting for me because Tokyo is a megacity. It's around 25 million people, an incredibly intense place. If you've ever been to Tokyo, very, very intense. People living right on top of each other, cheek by jowl. And the reason that I show this picture is because this is going to become the reality across the board. In China at the moment, for example, you already have over 160 cities with more than 1 million people. 160 cities with more than 1 million people. We've never even heard of 99% of them. But as the populations grow, cities are going to become bigger and big cities are going to become more numerous. And when I talk about population growth, you can see from the United Nations, this is the population growth that's expected going forward. We're sitting at about 7.3, 7.4 billion people at the moment. In my lifetime, I think that's a good 3 or 4 billion additional to what it was when I was born in 1970. You can now work out how old I am. And one of the other very interesting changes is that more and more people are living in cities. So 2010 was the year in which more than 50% of people started to live in cities for the first time in history. And that is moving towards around 70% globally. So 70% of 9.5 billion people will be living in cities. Now you can start to understand why I suggest that Tokyo might be the model of what cities will look like going into the future. What we can only hope is that what Tokyo looks like in terms of organization is going to be what most of those cities look like. The reality is that they're probably more likely to look like Lagos, Nairobi, or Kinshasa. Okay? So expect that cities are going to be bigger and cities are going to be more chaotic going forward. I talk about those African cities because of course, we are in Africa, and around 60% of Africans today are under the age of 24. So it's a very young population, and you can see that the population of the countries, the most populous countries of Africa, are expected to go through a massive population increase over the next 30 years. So a significant rise in Africa's population from around 1 billion to 2 billion between 2015 and 2050. And you can see that some of the countries like Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, etc., are going to more than double their populations. So a real challenge for those countries to manage that growth, particularly since they aren't exactly the most organized to start with. And it's a challenge for us in South Africa. Because if you look at the South African population, I'm trying to see where it is, somewhere about 2/3 of the way down, just above the DRC. You can see that South Africa's population is not anticipated to grow significantly. And the major reason for that is because we are already a substantially urbanized population. And urban populations don't have huge population growths. So if you look at South Africa's population and you look at where it's come from and where it is today, it's sitting fairly stable. And the real reason for that is that as people have moved from the rural areas where they were falsely kept during the apartheid years into cities, the population growth has absolutely crashed from what it was back in the 1980s. So it's really dropped off and is continuing to drop off. And as a result, our own natural population growth within South Africa is likely to stay stable. But of course, with all of this lot from north of us, guess where they're going to be looking for opportunity? So we are also going to be under pressure, and our cities are also going to be under pressure from populations north of us in the rest of Africa. Of course, I talked about let's hope that we can manage that growth, and certainly we would hope that, the sort of organized public transport, all of that sort of thing that we experience to a large degree here in South Africa today will remain the case and doesn't end up being the chaos that we experience in places like Lagos and other places. On a global basis, I think it's interesting to look at how people will move. So if we are more nodal in terms of being very focused on big cities, how will we move between those cities, and how will we move within those cities? I think between the cities, there's interesting advances taking place around technology, particularly with fast train travel. Top left-hand corner there is the Hyperloop, which Elon Musk has been promoting and pushing. It is under testing at the moment in Dubai, the Hyperloop, and Dubai is probably going to be the first city between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, those two cities, that will actually implement a Hyperloop. If anyone doesn't know what a Hyperloop is, it's basically a massive vacuum tube with no oxygen inside it that has a train that runs through it, and because there's no oxygen and it's a vacuum, it can travel at around 1,000 kilometers per hour. So from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, you're talking about a half-hour trip, and it makes it very possible to commute between those two centers. Similarly, air travel, continual improvements in technology, it makes it much easier for people to move from one city to another. Within cities, definitely a focus on more automated, autonomous vehicles. Top right-hand corner there is a Chinese drone which carries one passenger at a time, which is currently in use, again, in Dubai. So Dubai is using, they have about 150 of these air taxis. You can go and climb into it. It's essentially the same drone that your child would be flying, except that it's big enough to sit inside. And you don't touch anything. You tell the screen where you want it to take you, and it takes over and it flies you from A to B. That way, you don't have to sit in the traffic. You don't have to be dealing with what has become quite significant traffic in Dubai. Similarly with cars, autonomous cars are becoming more and more of a mainstream. Bottom right there is a technology which enables you to be present in a place without actually being there. So it has wheels, it has a camera, it has a screen. You can move around the office and you can actually interact with people even though you may be 1,000 kilometers away using the internet. So all of these technologies make it possible for us to be based somewhere entirely different to where we are expected to work, which is an interesting thing because if you start to look at what's happening in some cities around the world like New York, you can see that New York, which is an exceedingly expensive city, is increasingly losing jobs to other cities that you would never have thought of as being financial centers. So they're losing financial jobs. So companies like Goldman Sachs, which have moved around 1,000 jobs to Salt Lake City, Utah. Deutsche Bank, which has moved similar numbers to Jacksonville, Florida, and the most recent announcement, which is Alliance Bernstein, a wealth manager, that's just announced that they're moving 1,000 jobs from New York City to Nashville, Tennessee. Clearly someone likes country music. But it shows the challenge that cities that become too expensive are faced with when you compare it with other alternatives elsewhere. And so looking at South Africa and the opportunities for us here, if you consider that by 2030, around 70% of our population will be urbanized, living in our major cities, what are the opportunities for these sorts of cities here in South Africa? What do we need to do to make places like Pietermaritzburg, Durban, PE, East London, etc., attractive enough for people to want to live here and be able to work wherever the hell they want to? They really don't need to be where they work. Another thing that's also happening is that because of the technologies, particularly the internet and that massive growing World Wide Web, we've got a change in the nature of organizations to what I describe as a platform organization. So your traditional hierarchical corporate structure is being replaced by a platform that really doesn't require a hell of a lot of people to run it. So if you look at a company like Airbnb, it has a $31 billion market valuation, does about $2.6 billion in revenue, with 3,100 people worldwide. Okay? It has 100 million guest arrivals every year. And the reason that they're able to do that is because they have 640,000 hosts who don't work for Airbnb, but are based all over the world renting out through their platform. On the other side, you've got other platform organizations that are becoming significant in size, and so Amazon being a good example of this with 566,000 employers. After Walmart, it is now the second biggest employer in America, 566,000 people. But it is also a platform organization with 900,000 affiliates and over 1.3 million people selling stuff through Amazon. So a real interesting change in the way in which business is done. At the same time, we've got traditional organizations that are becoming more and more consolidated. The most recent announcement of companies that are coming together was Asda and Sainsbury's. Asda and Sainsbury's in the UK, two of the big supermarket chains, when they come together, they will become a £54 billion business with a 36% market share in the retail industry in the UK. So a move towards really big consolidated organizations at the same time as having these platform organizations that need fewer and fewer people. So how will we work? This is an interesting one for your industry. Repetitive tasks are undoubtedly not going to be done by people. So auditors, junior lawyers. So let's take the law profession as an example. The junior lawyers are the ones that tend to go and do the research, to go and find case examples, et cetera, et cetera. You now have artificial intelligence that can do that faster and can access millions of articles all over the world for the same task. You don't need a library in your law office anymore, and you don't need a bunch of junior lawyers to do it. You get AI and they do it for you. The challenge with that is how do you train lawyers if you don't have any junior lawyers? So as a senior lawyer, you have to have been a junior lawyer, but if you don't have junior lawyers because AI has taken over that role, How do you get to the point? And I think your industry has to look at exactly the same challenge. Similarly, dangerous work is being replaced by machinery as well. So this is a picture from Rio Tinto's iron ore mine in Australia. They have about 200 trucks, all of which are entirely autonomous. They do not have a single driver sitting in one of those trucks. They have people who sit in control rooms and who monitor what happens with that truck, but it's much safer and much quicker, and they can run 24 hours a day because drivers don't get tired when there is no driver. So there's a real change in terms of the way that we work. We're also increasingly used to being monitored, so being watched, being on the clock all the time because we're wearing information technology gathering equipment. And so that enables us and is driving the economy towards much more of a gig economy. So what Mike was talking about earlier, this sense that we need to get a job for life is not going to be the norm 20 years from now. You will do lots of different things. You will not work for PwC and be an employee of PwC for 20, 30 years. You'll do a lot of different things over time. So a real change. The downside of that, of course, is that people become lonelier. They don't have the social network that goes with what we expect at the moment. So empathy and understanding and the human elements of work is becoming increasingly important. The youth, of course, are the people that are going to experience the biggest change because there's a lot of gray hair in the room, including myself. And so 20 years from now, I'll be pushing 70. And it's unlikely that this stuff's really going to affect me to the degree that it will affect my children. So what's happening with the youth? I think, first of all, one of the characteristics of the youth of today is that they're much less worried about privacy. They are much keener on sharing and telling everybody about their thoughts and their what they do and all of that sort of thing. And as a result, they expect to be understood. When you share all your data and you share all your experiences and you swipe your Woolworths card and whatever else it is, you expect that the people that are taking that data are going to understand what you want and they're going to provide you with what you want. So a real change in terms of being quite frustrated if businesses don't understand their customers and understand them well. The youth are more connected, they're more connected to each other, and they're more connected to their parents. And as a result, they have a much closer relationship with their parents than we ever had before. So the big challenge, of course, that they face is competition. There's more and more of them. Remember, 9.5 billion people, and those people are all going for the same opportunities. So the youth of today do not have any guarantees around jobs, around opportunities. They have to compete. And as a result, they're becoming more and more serious. So if you have young kids, as I do, an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old, they take life quite seriously. And you can see this already in the rich countries, where what's happening is that the kids are doing less naughty things than they did previously. So if you look at the stats which show how many teenagers of 15 years old have been drunk at least twice, you can see that across the 5 countries that they've surveyed, that number has decreased quite dramatically. If you look at how many have had sex, you can see the same thing, also decreasing quite dramatically. And then on the other hand, if you look at the stats showing that they find it easy to talk to their fathers, that's the opposite effect. So they're more serious, they're taking life more seriously, they're less hedonistic than certainly was experienced back in the 60s and 70s. How they'll learn, an interesting change in terms of the way that education is provided, and much of it is going to be online. MIT, the world's premier engineering university, have opened up all of their courses online, so anyone, anywhere in the world can study MIT's courses. So they have 2,400 courses available, and over 300 million people accessing them. That's a really interesting fundamental change in the way in which people learn, rather than going and sitting in a classroom-based environment. And so the way in which people learn, home learning, homeschooling, using things like Khan Academy, and of course in this country, with the fees must fall and the pressure that will be on traditional universities, we'll see a growth in things like Boston College, Varsity College, various other things like that. And then finally, I want to finish off with an idea of how we'll play, because, of course, we're becoming more serious, but we will also still want to play. And much of this is also being driven by changes in technology. So if you take a step back and you look at the 1800s, 1827, Edwin Budding was the inventor of the lawnmower. Prior to that, the only way you could really cut grass was with a thing called a scythe. You may remember the Grim Reaper, and you would walk through and you would cut the grass like that. Very difficult to play football on a field that had been cut with a scythe. So as a result of the invention of the lawnmower, they were able to create flat playing fields. In 1863, the English Football Union was formed. And of course, by 2018, the field sports industry is worth $620 billion. So the invention of the lawnmower led to what we think of as sports today. The change in technology is affecting sports across the board. This is a picture of a wave that was taken in November 2017. I use it being in Durban. It is the biggest wave that's ever been surfed in history, 80 foot, by a guy called Ricardo Coxa from Brazil, in Nazaré in Portugal. Now, there are three interesting technologies that he has there that surfers have never really had access to on a mass scale in the early days of surfing. One is the wetsuit. Nazaré is bloody freezing. I've surfed there myself before. It makes Cape Town look warm. The second one is a jet ski. You can see in the top right-hand corner there is a jet ski. You would never be able to paddle into a wave of that size. So with the jet ski, you're able to get onto the wave before it starts to break and have the velocity to be able to keep going. And the third one is an inflatable life vest that surfers of big waves use today. So when he came off that wave, and he was definitely going to come off that wave at some point, he inflates the vest and he pops to the surface so he doesn't drown. So those three technologies have taken surfing from its early days of Waikiki, where you paddled in on a 20-foot board, to what they're able to do today. So we're experiencing a fundamental change in sport across the board because of technology. Sticking with the surfing theme, one of the things that is happening in sport is more precision, more data collection, more ability to repeat tasks if you need to do things. And this is a wave pool in Spain. And wave pools today are becoming very, very sophisticated. That wave looks like any good wave on a good day here in Durban, except that you can reproduce it every 8 seconds. So, and you can also program it so that it's bigger, smaller, et cetera, et cetera. So you can put people onto those waves, you can test them, you can measure them, you can see exactly what they're doing wrong, and you can make them do it again minute after minute after minute. So it's doing for surfing what the indoor arena has done for cycling in the UK, for example. The Manchester Indoor Arena has fundamentally changed Britain's position in road cycling, and as a result, Sky won the Tour de France recently. So that's more precision. The other thing is more extreme. This is wingsuit flying. It's probably one of the most extreme sports in the world. You jump off the side of a mountain and you fly like a bird. You do have to land somehow, so they do have parachutes as well. But you will notice one thing that he has on his helmet, which every wingsuit flyer has, which is a camera. And this is the reason that sport is becoming more and more extreme, is that people are recording themselves doing more and more extreme things and sharing it with everybody else. So this extremism in sport is likely to increase, and we're going to see more and more of this move towards extreme sports. And then finally, there will be a blend, an increasing blend of our traditional field sports and sports that we can watch and we think of as being the sports that we love, and esports. So there's a huge growth globally taking place at the moment in esports, where 20, 30,000 people go to a stadium and they watch people playing video games. Seems like watching paint dry to me, but it is a massive growth industry. So we're going to see the growth of traditional and new esports at the same time. So what do you need to do with your children? I think this is me, the headhunter, coming in. Competencies, the kind of skills that we need to get kids to consider and to learn. The first one is creativity and innovation. Taking all of this into account, what separates us from machines is consciousness, creativity and innovation. If you can get your kids to be creative and innovative, you're heading in the right direction. Empathy. People will use machines, but they are not machines. So you need to treat them with the human touch, and teaching empathy to the kids is really something that will help them in their economy of the future. Agility, never stop learning. Consider that gig economy. Consider the fact that you will be moving from one place to another, one job to another. If you are not agile and flexible, you're going to get left behind. And then finally, compassion. Talking about what Mike spoke about earlier, which is that we have to find ways in which we can get people onto the same plane and narrow that digital divide. Because much of this stuff is driven by access to technology, and access to technology is driven by access to money. And if you have a hugely divergent population, you're going to have this portion of the population that's able to take advantage of these changes, and this portion of the population that's going to get left behind. So we have to, as a society, develop the sense that everybody's got to be brought up and able to compete in the new economy. I hope that's given you some interesting things to think about, and I'd like to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Guy, for that presentation. Some very, very interesting points about the future. Some very important things to consider, the fourth industrial revolution, the coming of it. I'd like now to open the floor to questions. And if there's any questions that anybody has, please ask. Damien?
Morning, gentlemen. Thanks very much. A question for Mark. At Cyril Ramaphosa's opening sort of address, or State of the Nation, he identified mining sector as a sunrise industry rather than a sunset industry. But given your feedback recently in your presentation on the coal and gold and platinum in particular, those two comments don't really talk to each other. How do you see what needs to change in the mining sector for Cyril to get to that sunrise sort of objective?
I think the one thing is that, first of all, commodities go through cycles. We're on the downward, long-term downward cycle, and commodities change. For example, coal was the major fuel 3 cycles ago, and then for 2 cycles we had oil as a major fuel. It looks more and more like electricity from the sun and solar and renewables will become the fuel of the future. So I don't know if that's going to be a longer-term sunrise industry in the coal, for example. But having said that, there are always parts of our mining industry that will remain. The things might change to rare earth minerals and so on. And then there's gold. Gold has been around for a long time. The problem with our gold mines, however, which makes me a bit worrisome, is that they're very, very deep. The deeper you go, exponentially the costs increase. To cool somebody at 200 meters is far less energy intensive than to cool somebody at 2 kilometers, or the mine. So I don't think it's so. And I think, like the oil producers in the Middle East, we must look beyond that. We have some stuff that works best for it can work in the meantime and can work well for a long time, like tourism. As I said, there will always be parts of the mining that will work. And I think we've got to look at how we can select industries, because we can't help all of them, where we can put a lot more emphasis in. But I think on the whole, no, I don't agree with Cyril Ramaphosa. We might have a boom in commodities. We missed the last one. But it's not an industry that's going to be around in 30 years' time the way it is today, with probably the exception of gold. I don't even know if platinum will be regarded as a, let's say, the same sort of precious metal thing as gold is.
Can I step in and add something to that? I think one of the things that we have to do, and it's being done to a degree, but not deeply enough at all, is do more research into what the industries of the future are and what the metals are that are going to be required. So, for example, if you knew that lithium, with the lithium-ion batteries, was going to be an industry 30 years ago, you would have made a lot of money investing in that space. In South Africa, there's a UWC, University of the Western Cape, actually has a research unit which looks into platinum and the uses of platinum in things like battery technology, storage of hydrogen, etc. I've actually been to their facility. A very interesting world-class facility in terms of the research that's being done to understand how we can develop new technologies to use platinum. We need to do more of that, because if we're just relying on the traditional iron ore, coal, gold, etc., I completely agree. It's a sunset industry. We have to look at what we did in the clothing and textile industry, where clothing and textile just fell apart because we were making white T-shirts and jeans. And that industry has reinvented itself into much more high-tech, much more fast fashion, shorter delivery times, etc. And so the clothing and textile industry has kind of revived in certain areas in a very different guise. And we've got to do the same thing, I think, with mining.
Just want to say a little bit of a statistic, but I have in my head, is that 45% of all platinum goes into car engines, particularly diesel. Now, I'm not saying it all falls away, but diesel cars are selling much worse than they did before. At the same time, the technology shift has been such that they use only half the platinum that they did before per engine. So when they recycle the cars, for each platinum car that, or diesel car that comes back, you can produce two with the platinum that you get from those cars. And the problem is we're not selling as much. So literally that 45% of your market is really, really under threat. And that's where Guy's right. If we can find another use for it, and so on. And we've got lots of minerals that we need to look at where we could find uses for. But I think the future is a much more diversified economy anyway. And I think we should look at ways of industries that support that diversification and leave it up to the market for the rest.
Thank you for that question and for the candid response. So if I were to say that companies should rather increase their R&D budgets, would that be in line with the future thinking, or would that not be? Okay.
Yeah, I would say so. I think that it needs to be targeted, and so I think a strategic increase in R&D is essential. I think it's something that South Africa has traditionally been quite bad at. Certainly over the last 20 years, we haven't done nearly enough R&D, and we've adopted technology from elsewhere. If you look at a country like China, they went through that phase of adopting, and they've now moved very much into targeted industries. For example, electric vehicles, they're absolutely leading the world as far as electric vehicles is concerned. And so they are becoming a tech leader, and they're spending tremendous amounts of resources on R&D. We've got to try and do more of that ourselves.
I agree, but I'd like to just change the emphasis a bit. We know the world is aging. Even in South Africa, the latest birth rate figures that we got from Stats SA, which is last year's population estimates, shows that the young people, the babies being born, are growing at 1.4%, whereas the people over the age of 60 are growing at 3.4%. And that's a worldwide phenomenon because we live longer. So if I look at that, I think part of it is doing that sort of market research. So it's not just the R&D, and then saying to yourself, right, if people are getting older, what would they want? They would like to obviously extend their lives even more, probably. They would like to live healthier. So maybe you say, all right, I have venison. Venison is seen as, say, a low-fat or whatever the health benefits are of venison. I would research that, do the marketing of that, and try and package that in a way that people in Europe or so can just get something that they heat up in the microwave or whatever the case may be. Because I think that's what you've got to look at. You've got to look at the R&D being more holistic in discover the trends that are going to not change overnight, discover what can be linked to those trends, and then discover the products or the strengths you have, because we in South Africa do have venison. We have a lot of we have a lot of crooks in that industry as well, because apparently you can buy, I don't know, yellow buffalo with pink spots and you pay a lot of money for it. But, let's be realistic and say that the parts that you want to look at in that sense. And I think those are the sort of things, and then we've got to put the stuff in place, whether it's the land policy of government where those animals are, the factories and the taxation that those factories are going to do, how they can write off that marketing cost. All those sort of things have got to come into a picture. And I'm just using that because it's an easy trend to identify the aging population of the world. And I think that's incredible that you can do that. And then also, when you do that, you say, all right, there's other things. I can link the tourism to it, because older people have more time, and in places like Europe, they have money, and they can come here, and they can come on a bus tour, and they can take pictures of all the venison that they're going to eat. And, so that's how I would link it. And that's just me, but that's what I'm trying to just add. So R&D is not always just these days the production, the high end. It is seeing the bigger trends.
Yeah, which is where I say it's strategic.
Yeah.
A strategic focus on R&D. You don't want to just do it for the sake of doing it. It actually needs to make sense. I completely agree.
More holistic. Do we have any other questions? Is there anybody else? Jürgen?
Hi, morning. Thanks for some great presentations. Got a question for both Guy and for Mike. The first one's for Guy. In keeping with the theme you have around how we live, how we work, how we play, maybe the accountants in the room, how do you see us transacting in the future? Maybe your view on cryptocurrency, and maybe in the future, how sustainable is it? And maybe for Mike, what's your view on the current impact of that currency on today's economy?
So I think how we transact is an interesting one. It's going through radical changes currently. So if you look at for example, the banking industry, one thing that I find hugely frustrating whenever I'm in London is that I cannot find an ATM because they simply are getting rid of them. People don't use them anymore because people don't need cash. So they're tapping and going, and we've started to experience it, but we're quite a long way off getting to the level that they are at. So if you need cash in London, you best get Google Maps and go and find where the damn ATMs are, because there are not many of them left. So that's kind of an indication of where it's heading. It's becoming more and more virtual. And cryptocurrency is an interesting one. I sat in a conference of bankers about 6 weeks ago, and I was fascinated by how absolutely clueless they are about what cryptocurrency is. But it's also very instructive, because industries that are turned on their heads by people who come from outside of the industry. And that's precisely what's happening. So I think the general agreement is that cryptocurrency will change the way in which business is done across borders. It will change the nature of foreign exchange and of transnational transactions. Exactly how, I don't think anyone is completely sure what it's going to go towards, but there's no doubt that 20 years from now, the way in which business is done across borders will be fundamentally different to the way that it is today. You won't have these middlemen to the degree that we have had traditionally.
I'm going to disagree slightly, if I may. The first thing is that there's always been people that want to control things. That's why we've got governments. Governments then interact, and they make regulations. Your industry survives on that regulation because I have to have, if I have a company, an auditor that looks at it and makes sure that I'm relatively honest. The cryptocurrency is not going to get a free ride, and there's too many bullshitters there too. So the other dirty secret of the cryptocurrency at the moment, particularly Bitcoin and Ethereum, is their energy use. They are very high. Each transaction can power an American house for over 30 days. the average American. So that's not sustainable. That we'll have other ways that we transact, I think, has been an ongoing thing. If we look at ATMs were new, now ATMs are not new. ATMs are no longer needed in many advanced societies that much. So the way you interact with people, there'll still be some transaction, but that transactional cost will become much, much lower. And I don't think the time and the energy that particularly Bitcoin and Ethereum, the two biggest ones, can give us now is where it should be. And note one thing, while they say, yes, we limit the amount of cryptocurrency, what they don't limit is the price of that cryptocurrency, and they don't limit the amount of splits that you can have. So instead of printing more, they just split more. It's very much a similar type of situation. So I'm not that positive on cryptocurrencies. What I would agree with Guy is that the way that we're going to transact will change. Some of the technology that these, or thinking behind it, maybe not the technology, will come in. And the other thing that they've noticed, if you look at that, there's a lot of criminality behind all of this, or secret transactions at least. And that's where the authorities are coming in and looking very, very hard at it. And I think that will always be an ongoing thing, where people try to make sure that nobody can see what the transaction is, because there will always be crooks, and there will always be rich people that want to hide their money away, or whatever the case may be. So that part of it, I think, is going to be an ongoing thing, because it has been for many, many, and that's where I think Bitcoin tapped into. I'm not sure they tapped the technology right. I think everybody thought the technology was great, but I don't think it is. To give you an idea, I do work for BankServe Africa, which is the middle of our payment service. They are charged 13 cents. They can charge the banks 13 cents. Not what you pay, what they get. They charge per transaction. An immediate EFT that you do is just over R1 something. If I look at that and I compare that with the current Bitcoin, and even if I fractionalize it, it's much, much more. So I don't think it's a cheaper alternative. And I think there are going to be better ways we're going to transact. There's no doubt that's been ongoing. We used to transact with gold coins, seashells, later it became paper money and then credit cards and EFTs. It will evolve. But I think cryptocurrencies itself, sorry for the long explanation, they have a dirty energy secret, and they have the regulators essentially against them. And we mustn't ever underestimate the power of regulation. It is one of those things that can stop a company, even like Uber, from operating. It is something that is there. And that's where I have my doubts about the cryptocurrencies.
So I think I agree with that, and I think that the point is just that the genie is out of the bottle. And so the thinking, the technology, etc., it'll evolve. There's no doubt. I mean, the way that it is at the moment, I agree with you. Regulation, etc., will evolve, and we'll start to try to control it. But the thinking and the technology is underway, and so we will do things differently.
Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. I'm going to ask for, or rather allow one more question for the sake of time. Just one last question. Is there anybody? Thomas? Sorry.
In your presentations, if we had to take the PES, political, economic, social, technological, everything is really recalibrating. Political, strongmen, economics are changing through monetary policy, which is now slowly unwinding. Social is really, in transition, and technological, as we know, through data and insight. And so with that, our way of understanding it seems to be largely political, around power. We understand now things are changing, so our reference points are power. Your last points, Guy, were all around kind of softer interaction skills, which are power rather than principle-based. You know, the whole back to the you know, the moral, doing the right thing, you know, which were your duty rather than the superhero. The superhero is the person who is inside of you trying to be greater. The duty is considering the world around you kind of to be more or bigger than you. How do you see this recalibration of conversation back to, I'd say, principles, and what would those new principles be rather than our current power understanding or reference points?
So I think, you know, the Me Too movement is an example of how I think that there's a move towards being more open in discussing some of the things that people face. And the fact that people are more online, they're more connected, they're always on, and they're always gathering information and knowledge and insight from people around them, will just make it a much more open conversation than has traditionally been the case. So I think going forward, values, principles, etc., are going to be more fluid. People are going to adjust their mindsets more easily because they are being exposed to more information than has traditionally been the case. And I think that what you can already see with the kids, with the millennials, they are much more aware of the problems that are being faced by the world than what has been the case previously. Because you can't be blind to it anymore. It's just there. It's available to see all the time. So I think what is already being established is that young people are much more values-based, they're much more principle-driven, and those sorts of softer elements that I put there are things that people are already thinking about. So I hope that answers your question, but I think that my view is that principles and values are going to become a much bigger part of the conversation rather than just pure profit, for example.
Okay, thank you for those responses. And I think for the sake of time, the presenters will be around so we can still have a conversation with them. I'd just like to thank the speakers again for taking a tour of Durban before you got here. You shared some insights on your way in. You can see the construction that's happening. And sometimes it makes me wonder, and I think something that was said last year when we had this downgrade, and they said, fly over Mhlanga and see how it's growing, or fly over Sandton and see how it's growing. So where is this exact recession? That's an interesting one, but I'll leave that to Mike. But nevertheless, thanks a lot to Mike and Guy for their presentations and making the time to come to us today and share their knowledge, their experience, and their expertise with us. And I'm sure that we have learned a lot through these two presentations and the questions. And I think the more important thing is, how can we take what has been presented today in terms of the value that has been derived, and how do we apply it, one, to our businesses, and two, to our own thought processes in the work that we do, be it public practice or in commerce and industry. And I think it's for each one then to digest the information that has been shared with you. So nevertheless, to move on, just to share one last little bit from a SAICA perspective, SAICA is busy with a project called CA 2025. Guy has spoken about future competencies and how things are going to be done into the future. So it's a project that we are carrying out to understand what a chartered accountant, an entry-level chartered accountant in 2025 is going to need for the economy and the business of what we're going to be in. And how do we train them now for them to have those competencies in order to achieve what we need to achieve then. Another interesting part is, at that point in time, what do we do? How do we upskill in terms of a competency point of view, the 45,000 chartered accountants that we'll already have by that time, already qualified? And that's going to be a serious challenge for us. So this is a project that is underway. Something significant that has come up is artificial intelligence that has been spoken about, critical thinking and connecting the dots. It's going to be another interesting competency to achieve, as well as data analytics. All of these things are connected together. But there's just a short snippet, excuse me, a short snippet from the research project of what we are doing, and it will be coming out and will be communicated with members. We also intend to have some focus groups on CA 2025 in the Durban area. So please, when you do see that invitation, if it perks your interest about the future and what the future competencies are going to look like, please do respond. We would look forward to your contribution. Just the last bits from me. Please, can you validate your parking on the exit? There's free parking for that. Taruna will be sending out the evaluations later on today. Please, if I can ask you to respond to that evaluation, or have you already sent it, Taruna? Okay, it's already sent, so you would have got it on your phone or your email. So please do complete it. Your feedback is important to us. And it does make a difference, because it makes no sense that we do the same thing over and over and expect to achieve a different result. We rather take your suggestions, provide value to you, because the time that you have spent must be of value. If we haven't done that, we have failed you. So we look forward to your feedback, and look forward to seeing you at future SAICA events. Take care and safe driving. Thank you.
The title's perfect, political osmosis. That's exactly the sort of world that we're living in at the moment, and the changes are so frequent and happen so quickly that as an accountant, in order to be able to advise your clients correctly, you need to keep up to date with that sort of stuff. So it was a great session. Both Mike and Guy were fantastic presenters. I particularly loved Guy's presentation, as to be able to start thinking about the trends that are going to be happening in the next 10, 15, 20 years is important. So fantastic session. I always love a good breakfast, so that was great.
Business breakfast was really insightful. It's nice to see the contrast of the economy. South Africa's economy is growing slightly, which is really good, and we've got some positive signs happening in our local economy, and also trying to understand how accountants are moving and must move in the global markets, and with the changes that we face and the new ways of working and how we should grow in them. So thanks, SAICA. Yeah, good event.
This was a fantastic event. I think SAICA hosting this event provides a great networking opportunity. There's fantastic people here who are dealing with in our type of environment, and you're getting to learn the various things that's happening in our industry. I think the presenters here today were fantastic. They gave us various different views on the economy. I think in the media today we got a lot of negative stuff coming through, and they were fantastic. They provided various different views, and there's a lot of positives in the South African economy. So great learnings from today's thing, and I think it's just beneficial all around to the industry that I operate in.
Yeah, Mark's session was entitled "A Country Renewed with Hope but Waiting for Reform." I found it particularly beneficial. I think one of the factors that I got out of this was what are good job multipliers as a percentage of like millions employed. For example, like the trucking industry, it just costs less than 1 million, but we're employing 3 people, a driver, 2 drivers, and a mechanic, versus like large investments in petrochemical industries. And South Africa is not faring that badly in the global context as well. You know, our growth rate's ticking up and things like that.
Okay. I found it to be a very interesting conversation. You know, we get caught up with our day-to-day activities and we don't look at the economy as a whole. So it's quite interesting to see some of the stats that came through from Mike, especially the ones on the debt to household levels and our minimum wages. And also just to see how the profession might transform in the future and the changes that's taking place and going beyond 2020. So I think I'll take that back to the office and see how we can implement some of these things going forward.
I found the event very interesting. When Mike was talking about the economy and where we're heading, one of the challenges I see is that as much as we're addressing corruption, corruption is so ingrained in whatever is happening in the country, so it's going to take us a long time. And I've had a discussion with him subsequently. He concurs that, I mean, it's not something that we can eradicate immediately or in the short term. So for me, I think that was an important outcome, just to understand what he was sharing with us and how we're going to move forward in our country. So his presentation was quite useful, very valuable. When we looked at when I saw Guy's presentation, and some of the things is, are we ready for the future? When I looked at, and that's a question I posed to him subsequent to the event completing, was if we look at our kids of today, are they getting exposed in terms of robotics and other things that they need to learn about at school. Our schooling system is not aligned to what's required for the future. So for me, that is something I think is a challenge for us in society. So coming to the event, it really gets a bit of thinking going. And I believe really events like this that SAICA brings to our members is of absolute value.
Thanks a lot to Guy and to Mike for their presentation today at the SAICA Eastern Region Business Breakfast. It was absolutely amazing. Now, could we ask you an interesting question? Would you be able to share with us your message and thought for our members?
I think the first thing I'd like to tell the members is we're looking at a much more optimistic situation in South Africa than we did before. And that's important for the members, but it's also important for the clients. So we're likely to see more business growth. We're likely to see a lot more things going their way than it did before. So I think in the South African sense, it's not perfect yet. It is not growing at the rate that we want it to grow, but it's certainly growing a lot better than the last 3 or 4 years before then. And my other message to the members is when business grows, then you can relook at your things like fees. You can not only grow market share, but the market is actually growing. And I think that's important for your members. They can find new clients. And I think we'll see a lot more opportunities. So I think for the first time, there's a little bit more optimism in South Africa, and I think that's important. And there is a bit more chances for the members to do things and also perhaps to look for clients other than taking other members' clients. So I think the market is growing, and I think that is the message I would have.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot, Mike. Guy, a message from your side to our members?
Great. I think it's important for organizations and the people that run those organizations to be aware that we've gone through 10 years of troubled times. It's been difficult, and it's quite easy to be continuously pessimistic when you're going through a period like that. But it's a period of change, and I agree with Mike. I think that there's a lot more optimism in South Africa and globally, and it's important for us to take advantage of that. We can't let that opportunity go by. We've got to be looking at opportunities. We've got to be looking at places where we can invest and where we can look for new business and new growth. And on top of that, I think it's also important to recognize that the nature of the economy, locally and internationally, is changing. And it's important to look out for longer-term opportunities and for places like Durban. What could Durban be 10, 15, 20 years from now? And what can your organization be doing to be a part of that as the place changes?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you to Guy, and thank you to Mike Schussler and Guy Landy for sharing this message with our SAICA members. And hopefully in that sense, it will spur some more conversations and more things to come into the more things to come in the future. Thank you once again.
Thank you.